Conflict in the Wild West, Part 2, Native Americans. In the first half of the 19th century, Native Americans enjoyed pretty much free reign in the American West. Only a very small number of white settlers traversed the West, as we discussed in the previous lecture, and Native Americans across the West enjoyed a relatively high level of prosperity. Native American policy, from the perspective of the United States or white settlers, was focused on Native American populations east of the Mississippi. This is the era of the policy primarily of removal. You might recall Andrew Jackson and his presidency and the process of removing the Cherokee and the other 5 civilized tribes from the east and sending them west, the most famous anecdote being the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee on their way out to Oklahoma. So prior to the Civil War, only a handful of white settlers disrupted this process. The Native Americans of the West were in fact a vastly rich and diverse array of independent cultures, as is suggested in the map and diagram that you see on your screen. There were dozens of individual groups or tribes, each of which had their own independent way of government, different ways of obtaining food. Some of them were migratory, others were more stationary. Some operated in terms of farming or raising food. Most of them followed the buffalo or migrated as the seasons changed. And there was a distinct power structure and sort of ranking among the tribes of the West that had been in place for centuries. The arrival of even small numbers of white settlers into this equation disrupted this balance that had been in place for hundreds of years. The earliest white settlers to cross the West, going back to the age of Lewis and Clark, the early 1800s, while small in number, had a dramatic impact on the Native Americans of the West. They carried with them a number of things that would radically shift the equations and balance of power among the Western tribes. One of the things that they brought, unseen by anyone involved, were diseases. The diseases carried by these settlers inflicted an awful toll on the Western tribes. Not quite as extreme as what we saw with the Eastern tribes in the age of Columbus and the first European explorers. Diseases such as smallpox brought by the first explorers wiped out many of the Eastern tribes of Native Americans. By this era, some level of immunity or some level of exposure had protected the Native Americans to a degree from diseases carried by the white settlers. Nonetheless, the diseases did spread extensively and exacted a tremendous toll on those tribes that were exposed to them. The white settlers also brought with them guns and other weapons. If you look at the tapestry at the bottom of this page, it presents a number of the things that I'm going to mention here, and what look like brooms in the hands of some of the Native Americans in that tapestry are actually guns that are firing. And of course, those tribes who were able to successfully trade for guns and ammunition from the white settlers then had a huge advantage over their traditional rivals among the other Native American tribes. Similarly, the Europeans introduced horses to the West, another item you see a number of in the tapestry at the bottom. And those tribes that were able to obtain horses quickly became very adept at riding them with tremendous skill, and again, attained a great advantage over their rivals. A final item introduced by the earliest of white settlers among Native Americans was alcohol. Now, I don't want to overstate the significance of alcohol because we run the risk of encountering stereotypes. But the fact is, alcohol was brought among the Native Americans by white settlers, and it did have a terrible toll. There are many, many instances, and actually in the post-Civil War era that is the topic of our discussion, alcohol did become an important part of the equation. In many of the treaties that were drawn up, it became common practice for white officers to ply the Native American leaders with alcohol before arriving at any final treaty. And there were a number of instances where Native Americans agreed to a treaty under the influence of alcohol without really understanding the impact of what they were doing. There's a final element of the tapestry below that requires a bit more extensive discussion, and that is the impact of white settlers on the buffalo. The buffalo was absolutely central to the survival of Native American civilizations in the West. Prior to the arrival of white settlers, we can only estimate the numbers of buffalo, but best estimates range into the millions. The great American herd of buffalo numbered in the millions, and numerous Native American tribes would follow the herd or parts of that herd across the West. It provided them with virtually everything they needed to survive. One professor of mine in the past used the phrase, the buffalo was a galloping department store. And if we think about an earlier age when most items were not available in stores or anything like that, the buffalo did provide almost everything that Native Americans needed. And they used every aspect, every shred of the buffalo, from the hides themselves to make clothing and tents. The bones were manipulated into all sorts of tools or weapons. They used the tallow. Of course, they ate the meat. They used the horns and every part of the buffalo. They also engaged in a deeply spiritual relationship with the buffalo. This was not merely something to be hunted and used. Rather, they had a profound appreciation for the significance of the buffalo in their survival. And I think we get a sense of that in the painting on this screen. While the Native Americans are hunting and in fact killing some of the buffalo, it's in some ways a pastoral scene, very pleasant to look at, and we get a sense that the Native Americans and the buffalo are one. The figures in the painting seem to be galloping along in unison, sharing this pastoral scene, sharing the great countryside before us. We will see some different approaches to images like this in the next few slides. The white settlers viewed the buffalo very differently. All of their material needs were met by various stores and other means back in the East. They didn't need buffalo hides for clothing or shelter. They really didn't need the meat of the buffalo. They had few needs related to it, and so they saw the buffalo as, in some ways, a nuisance, and in other ways, an opportunity for sport. And I think we have both views of that in this picture of the Transcontinental Railroad making its way across the West. You might be familiar, and in this painting you get just a peek of what they call the cow catcher on the very front of the train, which was there for exactly the purpose of kind of shoveling aside any buffalo that might be in the way, which you see very profoundly in this picture. At the same time, the Transcontinental Railroad would stop periodically when the buffalo herd was in sight and allow passengers and others to fire out into the herd, as we see in this picture, we presume for the sport of it, for the fun of it. It's somewhat appalling to think at this time, but there were those on the train who would have perceived this as great fun. And once the hunt was over, once they had shot and killed as many of the buffalo as they could, the train would resume its course and head out across the west. This conveys just a completely different sense of the way the white settlers thought about the wilderness and the buffalo in particular versus the way Native Americans perceived them. Eventually, a very intentional relationship is drawn between the destruction of the buffalo and the destruction of the Native American tribes of the West. The American government and other interests became very much actively involved in exterminating the great American buffalo herd. You can get a sense of that from the picture you see here, which, if you look closely, you will notice is an enormous mountain of sorts of buffalo skulls. There had been a sense for decades that the Native Americans more or less needed to make way for the white settlers. The white settlers were coming, the American government is coming, and the Native Americans need to move on out of the way. President Andrew Jackson said in 1832, "These tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements and in continual contact with our citizens. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement. They must necessarily yield to the force of circumstance and ere long disappear." Now, this was back in the era of removal in the 1830s. He was talking about the eastern tribes. But the mentality applies equally to those tribes in the West. And by the era of our discussion, it was plain that by destroying the buffalo herds, the American government and white settlers could remove a great point of strength from the Native Americans of the West. If the buffalo provided everything that the Native Americans needed, well, let's get rid of that. And then the Native Americans will have no choice. They had to meet their needs somewhere. They had to get clothing and food and shelter somewhere, and it would come from the white settlers and the American government itself. The phrase that was used at that time was that every buffalo killed is another Indian dead. And so we see a shift in American policy toward the Native Americans in the West after the Civil War. If the primary policy prior to the Civil War was removal, that is, sending the tribes of the East out to Oklahoma and other parts of the West, well, there isn't any more open and unclaimed land to send them to, and those lands in the West were now precisely the lands that white settlers sought for themselves. And so removal wouldn't work anymore. We needed a different approach. And so in the years after the Civil War, we see American policy falling down under two major themes, one of which is the assignment of Native American tribes to ever-shrinking parcels of land known as reservations. Now, a related development to this is that one of the major policies was the drawing up of treaties and arriving at things peacefully. And I mentioned on a previous slide the prominence of alcohol in many of these negotiations. The second major theme is that of war. There are many instances in which Native Americans signed treaties, agreed, however reluctantly, to go on to the reservations. But there are many others in which they didn't agree to go peacefully, and in such cases, American forces pursued them in what we know as the Indian Wars, which waged off and on from 1854 to 1890. Now let me mention an early example of the first of these themes, the theme of reservations, and that is the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. This is one of the largest recorded gatherings of Native Americans in our history. Some 10,000 Native Americans representing several different tribes met with American leadership at this gathering at Fort Laramie in 1851. At that meeting, they were told by the American representative, Colonel Thomas Fitzpatrick, that the Great Father, now this could be the American government, the president, the white man, it's a metaphor on a number of levels. Fitzpatrick says, "The Great Father is aware that your buffalo and game are driven off, and your grass and timber consumed by the opening of roads and the passing of immigrants through your countries. For these losses he desires to compensate you." Now, for those who are beginning students in English composition, this is a classic instance of the use of passive voice and why it is a perhaps dangerous thing. I think in this case it's done intentionally. The Great Father is aware that your buffalo and game are driven off. Well, who's driving them off? The Great Father himself has done this. The white man has done this. And now he wants to compensate you. Now, the treaty itself involves a number of different things, but in essence, it is the first sign of what will become the reservation system. The part of the treaty I want to focus on involved the American government paying $50,000 per year to the Native American tribes to guarantee safe passage for the Western settlers across the West. It designated a very narrow strip of land all the way across the West. In essence, the Oregon Trail was protected by this treaty, and essentially it confined Native Americans to two huge swaths of land on either side. These might be thought of as the earliest reservations. Now, they essentially make up the entire American West, except for that very narrow strip of land. But what we will see is that in the years following this treaty, those reservations will get smaller and smaller and smaller, and in effect, the narrow strip of land guaranteed to the white settlers will grow larger and larger.